I want to bring in former federal judge and president of Dickinson College, John Jones. Also with us, former communications director of the Republican National Committee and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Here in studio is MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Lisa, what's going on with this filing and what are the stakes today?
Well, Chris, let's start with what it is that they have been ordered to give to the judge today. By 12 noon today, Judge James Boasberg, a federal judge in D.C., ordered the Trump administration to do one of two things. Either they had to invoke what's called the state secrets doctrine and explain to him why, citing case law and facts, they could not reveal more information about the flights that took off on Saturday during a period of time that he was holding a hearing and he had ordered them to turn those flights around, why they can't provide those details in the interest of national security and foreign policy, that they are so secretive in essence, that they couldn't even share them with a federal judge who is authorized to receive classified information. Alternatively, they can answer 5 questions that he has about the flights. When did they take off? When did they land? How many people are on those flights? And most importantly, when were those folks turned over to El Salvador in custody, which matters to him in terms of whether they were in compliance with his order. Right now, as you know, it's well after 1 o'clock, and we have not seen that filing. I continue to push refresh on the electronic docket on my phone to make sure that we're in possession of the most up-to-date information.
Judge Dickinson, is there a legitimate reason you can think of that would not have been posted yet?
I can't think of a reason, Chris. This is, to me, astonishing and a little bit breathtaking. I can only think that the government is temporizing at this point, and they're just going to see if they can play this out. Typically, as Lisa knows, when there's a hard deadline that's set by court, and indeed a deadline that has been continued for a couple of days, repeatedly, you're going to want to hit the mark if you're the party that is subject to the deadline. I can think of no other reason, and I hope this isn't the case, but that they're trying, as the Wall Street Journal said, to force a showdown here.
I apologize. I think I made you the founder of the college of which you are president. But Judge Jones, let me ask you this. The attacks on the judge aren't just coming from the presidents. I want to play what the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, said just yesterday on Fox.
I will tell you is this judge has no right to ask those questions. You have one unelected federal judge trying to control foreign policies, trying to control the Alien Enemies Act, which they have no business presiding over. And there are 261 reasons why Americans are safer now. That's because those people are out of this country. The judge had no business, no power to do what he did.
Let's be clear here, Judge. Is this judge exceeding his power?
Not at all. And Pam Bondi knows that's not the case. And this is what this administration does, is they basically say that the end justifies the means. And we don't know, and that's what Judge Boasberg is trying to find out, first of all, what the timing was, who's on the flights, and so forth. But the central question, again, as your panelists know, as Lisa and Doug know, the central question is whether or not this archaic, several-century-old law will allow the government to do what it did without due process. There's the root of it that eventually I think Judge Boasberg's going to have the opportunity to get to unless the circuit interferes. But right now he's trying to vindicate an injunction that he entered last Saturday, and he's trying to figure out did they defy that injunction. And again, as your panelists know, unless and until that injunction is dissolved, it's operative, and he has absolutely the right to do it. And as Chief Justice Roberts said the other day, the remedy in this case, he's preserved the status quo. The remedy is to appeal, but it's not to defy the court order, and hence the showdown that appears to be emerging at this point with this complete disregard of the deadline by the government.
I think it was Justice Breyer who said, look, this happens every day. A judge rules and one side is not happy. It is another thing to rip apart a judge, particularly if you have the kind of platform that a president or a member of the administration does. And Judge Esther Salas from New Jersey lost her 20-year-old son to political violence, and she told my colleague Nicole Wallace, it feels like people are playing Russian roulette with the lives of judges. Listen.
I know the value of human life because I've lost the most important thing in my life. And once that genie is out of the bottle, there's no putting it back. So we have to remember that we may not, sometimes we say things in the heat of advocacy, but I just wish that people would realize that we got to tamp it down a bit. Because God forbid someone is killed. There's no turning back for that family. There's no turning back for that judge.
No turning back for her family, and you can hear the emotion, Judge, in her voice. What does this moment feel like for folks on the bench all around the country?
Well, Chris, in addition to the parade of horribles that you stated, what we also have are members of Congress publishing information about family members of these judges, and we have activists also outing family members, children of sitting judges. Now, I wonder how a member of the United States Congress would feel if their family members were identified and vilified in this fashion. And of course, President Trump's family appropriately has Secret Service protection. Judges signed up for a certain amount of risk. We knew that when we took the bench and put the robe on. Family members, not so much. I think this is really scurrilous behavior to implicate family members, and I have said this repeatedly. I served on the Judicial Security Committee by appointment of the Chief Justice. We're going to get somebody killed. Already, Esther Salas, as you just noted, has lost her precious only child, her son. If we're not careful and we don't dial down this rhetoric, it's going to happen again.
And Doug, I think it's important to note again the facts. This judge is not the radical left lunatic the president claims he is. In fact, it was the president's own former White House attorney, Ty Cobb, who made the point. Take a listen.
I mean, having, creepy Caroline Leavitt, trying to talk about this judge as somehow a leftist Democratic judge when he was originally appointed by George Bush, and when he when he was the judge who ordered the release of 14,000 Hillary Clinton emails. This is a judge who plays it straight down the middle. He's ruled very decisively for Republican-leaning positions and very decisively for Democratic-leaning positions, making it plain that he is not an ideologue. This is somebody who follows the law. And he's done so with great character and great success, rarely reversed.
And I think the question here and the concern, Doug, is when the president of the United States, with his platform, says the opposite, do facts hold any real weight?
Well, they should, but they often don't. And Donald Trump knows that. Obviously, we see this rhetoric from Trump over and over and over again and have for years. But the problem and the rhetoric also predates Donald Trump. I worked, Chris, at the Republican National Committee on that Saturday morning when Gabby Giffords was shot. The two police officers who were shot when Steve Scalise was attacked at that baseball game, I worked very closely with in Majority Leader Eric Cantor's office. They were part of his protective detail. And we saw just last week a candidate was arrested for trying to arrange shootings on his opponents who for some reason he blames for all sorts of things. These are happening more and more. Donald Trump is certainly an accelerant to this, but it's incumbent on all of us to use smarter rhetoric. And it's one of the reasons that I would tell candidates and members of Congress, Republican or Democrat, think really carefully about doing town halls because of how those kinds of events can get out of hand very quickly and have a real plan of action if somebody comes there to do more than just screaming and yelling, which isn't helpful to the process to begin with.
And Doug, NBC News confirmed that Elon Musk has been donating to members of Congress who back impeaching judges. He also posted, by the way, that they need 60 senators to impeach a judge and, as he put it, restore the rule of law or rule of the people. It would actually take 67 senators. But, I mean, first of all, you have donations that are being brought about by somebody who has a very powerful role in government. And I just wonder, do Republicans want to get into this about having to impeach judges for doing their jobs?
No, I've talked to a few members of Congress in the past week or so, and they want to talk about jobs. They want to talk about how they're going to grow this economy. You know, we've talked so often over the past several months about the price of eggs. Eggs have fallen every week for the past 4 or 5 weeks. I would want my congressional candidates, my members of Congress, talking about that. But that also starts with the president talking about that. Trump did so well for himself when he went to that fast food restaurant in the campaign. I'd send him to a grocery store right now. Focus on those things that should be your strong suit, where he's underwater in the polls right now anyways.